So when we talk about buying a franchise, there are probably two different ways that you could go about that. First of all, you could invest in a new franchise business that you're going to start yourself. And secondly, you could acquire an existing franchise business from a franchisee that already runs it, and that's sometimes called a franchise resale. I mention that because the key legal documents that you would expect to see and want to look at in relation to each way of acquiring a franchise are slightly different. Common to both of them though is the franchise agreement, which is the main legal contract between the franchisor, that's the person that owns the franchise system, and the franchisee, the person wanting to operate a franchise business, most likely in their local area under that system. The contract forms the basis of the legal relationship between them. It grants the franchisee the right to operate their business, and it sets out their respective rights and obligations. If we're talking about buying an existing franchise business or a franchise resale, then there are other legal documents that you would expect to see that I would say are also key. Things like a sale and purchase agreement, due diligence information, potentially a lease agreement for any property that you're going to occupy whilst you're running the business. And there are some other documents that might sit alongside, depending on what the variance is from brand to brand. So in some franchises you might get a supply agreement, in others you might have a separate trademark licence. It kind of depends, but broadly those are the things that you're going to be looking for. I find this question quite interesting because I think the concept of a typical business contract is a little bit fluid. It kind of depends on your experience and where you're coming from. But what I've had in mind really is something that's between two businesses that is like negotiated and drawn up. And I guess a franchise agreement differs quite greatly from that type of agreement because franchise agreements tend to be set by the franchisor and are often presented on a non-negotiable basis to a franchisee. Now, that has some important rationale behind it. So from a franchisor's perspective, they're going to be entering into multiple franchise agreements, sometimes hundreds of franchise agreements with lots of different individual franchise operators. So from their perspective, it's extremely important to have consistency across their network, because having a variation in terms across lots of different people is obviously going to be quite unmanageable for them. But it also creates a degree of fairness because everyone gets the same terms and everyone signs up to them and operates their business under them. So I guess from that perspective, that is a key distinction. I guess also that franchise agreements are quite distinct in that they are granting you the right to operate a business under the franchisor's system, and that is more intertwined than a typical business agreement would be, because it's like you're operating a specific outlet of their business, and it has to offer a consistent customer experience and have kind of branding that's consistent. So that kind of intertwined nature of it is quite different. I guess also as well, the franchise agreement is catering for quite a long-term relationship. So I don't think there are many business contracts out there that would cater for a 20-year term. And there are, examples of franchise agreements that do have terms of that length. I'd say the typical length is more like 5 years, but still that's quite a lengthy agreement when you look at through the lens and in the context of kind of normal business contracts. So I think because it has to stand the test of time, it has to really look into the future and think about lots of things about how, what might happen and cater for lots of different eventualities. So I think for that reason as well, it is quite a different thing than what you would say a typical business agreement is. I think obviously the agreement as a whole is, I wouldn't say there's anything that you could skip over necessarily when you're approaching a franchise agreement. You need to understand the whole thing. But I have picked out a couple of specific kind of clauses to kind of really, concentrate on. One would be a personal guarantee. So for most franchise agreements where the franchise is going to be operated by a limited company, the franchisor will ask for a personal guarantee from the individual director or shareholder or shareholder of that limited company. Because otherwise, in the event of non-payment of fees to the franchisor or perhaps business failure, the franchisee would be able to hide behind the veil of corporate liability effectively, and that might be a relatively new limited company and probably won't have much else in it other than the franchise. So that would potentially leave the franchisor in a situation where it was unable to recover. So for that reason, it is quite commonplace for the individual to provide a personal guarantee. But whilst it is quite commonplace, you should understand what that means for you, because in the event of a business failure or something like that, you would find yourself in a situation where your personal assets might be at risk. So you would have to look into your own personal bank account to make good whatever liabilities that franchise company had to the franchisor. So I guess one of the other things I would say to pay particular attention to is restrictive covenants. So many people might be familiar with the restrictive covenants, particularly if you've ever entered into a senior employment contract or you've ever sold a business. You will find typically restrictive covenants in those types of agreements. So what we're talking about here is like non-compete restrictions, restrictions on poaching staff, restrictions on dealing with customers, and they're there to protect the goodwill of the business effectively. And in a franchise agreement, those types of restrictions will typically apply during the term of the agreement, but also then for a period of time thereafter. And you should really consider on the way in what that is going to mean for you in the long term, because many people will embark on a franchise business and expect to be operating that franchise business until they retire. Others might expect to do it for a more, on a shorter term basis, or your life circumstances might change and you might decide that you need to go away and do something else. And those are all perfectly natural curves in, the way that the relationship might work. But when you come out of your franchise, those restrictive covenants are then going to bite for a period of time thereafter. And if your plan is to operate a similar business or to be employed in the same industry, those restrictions might affect your ability to earn a living, and you should consider how you would approach that and deal with that on the way in, I think. So yeah, there's just two examples of things to particularly pay attention to, but of course there are lots of others. So I would say when you are investing in a franchise, that it's probably going to be one of the biggest investments that you make in your life. Not only in terms of money, but also in terms of time and effort that you're going to pour into making your business a success. I don't think there are many other investments in life where you wouldn't get that investment looked over by a solicitor. So if you were buying a house, for example, you would involve a solicitor in that process. So, and the same goes for investing in a franchise. So I would say at a relatively early stage, once you've chosen the brand that you want to go with and you're somewhat progressed in terms of the journey, I would say that you'll probably get a template version of the franchise agreement for that particular network. I would at that point look to identify a solicitor that you're going to work with to have that agreement reviewed. The BFA website is a great place to start in terms of identifying an appropriate solicitor, because they maintain a directory of advisor members. So these are solicitors that have had to go through an accreditation process to prove that they have experience in franchising. And I think that's really one of the key points in terms of choosing someone to work with who has the appropriate experience, because I think lawyers are often portrayed in the media as being kind of one trick. They can do everything. They can do your will, they can buy your house, they can do a bit of everything,